morning. I'm going to be talking about server-side web properties. Server-side web properties is a new part of the web app framework, and it was actually pretty hard to fill a presentation with it because it is so easy to use. So we'll just go on and start with a little recap of what is the web app framework and what are web properties for. I won't be digging into this too long, but the web app framework is based around the fact that there is a thing called web objects in DataFlex. Web objects are objects that are actually, you use that to build your application, and they are sent to the client, and they tell the client, the JavaScript engine that runs on the client, what it should put on the screen. So in short, there is DataFlex classes like web form, web view, web list, web column, and on the client there's JavaScript classes, the same classes, matching classes, web form, web button, and they know how to communicate with each other. And the glue between the client and the server is basically the web properties. So within the web app framework, we have invented these properties. It's a meta tag, and we invented these properties that are sent to the client to tell the client what it should put on the screen. So how should it look? So we invented these to configure the user interface, and they can actually change on the client. If you look at an example like PS value tells the client what value it should show in the form. But if the user types in something else, it will also send back the new value to the server so that the server knows what the user has typed in. One of the things we run into while developing the web app framework is that there is no persistency on the server. The server gets a request, and well, it knows kind of which client sent it, but it doesn't know what the exact state of the client is at that point. The web properties solve that problem for us because the web properties are sent to the server, telling the server what the current state of the user interface on the client is. But you also needed to store things like a row ID that you wanted to show later on, or a filter that you need for your data dictionary. And it actually turned out that web properties were a pretty convenient place to store your application state. And the alternative is to extend your session manager to add extra fields to your web app session table and to store it there. But that is a lot more work, so using web properties turned out to be quite convenient. The problem with web properties actually is, there is a security risk there. Web properties are sent to the client, meaning that they are inside the browser, and they're actually stored in JavaScript variables. So they can actually be seen and changed using browser development tools. If you have Chrome, for example, it comes with a development tool. You press F12, you type a few things, and you just see and will be able to change the web property values. Of course, customers also found out about this, and they started asking for encrypted web properties, but we found that server web properties will be a better way of solving the problem. I'm going to do a quick demo to show that you can actually change web properties in the browser, and also to give you a feel of what web properties are used for. So if we look at the web order sample, and I'm going to run it. This is the desktop style sample. You'll be seeing a lot of mobile stuff. This is what the desktop style stuff looks like. And there's a sample in there. It's called constraint grid, and it basically shows you how to build up a grid that you can filter with a couple of fields above. It's a bit simpler than the search thing we did during the training, but it allows you to select, for example, number and filter on the number. So we can say from 10 till 16. We update the filter, and now we see record 10 till record 16. If we look at how this is implemented, we look at the source code here. We're going to open the view, which is called demo constraint grid. There it is. Is this large enough to read? All right. We see that in the data dictionary, we have programmed a constraint that reads a couple of web properties, and it builds up a filter based on that, a constraint. I'm sure most of you DataFlexes know things like this. So. And here we're seeing that there are some web properties being defined. So we have PS filter, which is the type of filter, basically the first combo form you were seeing. You have filter from and filter to. And what you might notice if you're familiar with the web app framework is that it used to say web property equals true. Now it says web property equals client, indicating that there will be other options there, which we will talk about later. But we see that there's PS filter from, PS filter to, and they're used as a way to, as a place to store the constraint, because for technical reasons you cannot read it directly from the forms in the data dictionary. Now if we go back to the browser, and I promised to show how you could change things, I'm going to open up the developer tools. This is the console. You can just write JavaScript here. So I'm going to look up this property. It's oweb-app.odemo constraint grid, and then PS filter from, for example. And if I press enter, I just see the value there. It's probably a bit small. Maybe I can zoom in. All right. So we see that it tells me that the filter from is set to 10. Well, we also see that on the screen, so this is not that much of a security issue. But if it would be a tenant ID or a constraint that you're actually not allowed to change, it would be. All right.
Not just me.
No, it's not. Good. I'll stand still then. Oh, web app. So what we're going to do now is we're going to change it. And so I'm going to say web app, demo constraint grid. And I'm going to say set, pass the name of the property. You see I did some practice runs. So I'm going to say PS filter from, and I'm going to set it to 5. Now nothing really changes. Well, it has changed, but we need to trigger the grid to actually refresh itself. And we can also do that from JavaScript. I'm going to say main panel, and list it is. And I'm basically going to change the sorting. This is the code that will be executed if you click on one of the headers of the grid. I just want to show that you can do that from within the console as well. So now if I do that, we see that it has refreshed, and it actually has loaded the data that falls outside of the constraints. So if this was a constraint that was constraining data based on my login or whatever, this would be a security issue. So this just shows that web properties, I mean, they're handy, they're good, but client web properties are not a good place to store sensitive data. Another reason why client web properties might not be the best place to store data that's not actually needed on the client is performance. Web properties are sent back and forth between the client and the server all the time, and that can actually slow down your application, and especially now that we have mobile web apps, they will be used on mobile devices, and they will be used on slower connections. I mean, I printed some things there like 3G, 4G, you all know it, but it can also be the GPRS or E, which are pretty slow connections, and web properties are sent back and forth a lot. So basically the main thought is, why do we actually send data to the client that is not used on the client? I mean, why do we do that? Well, the main answer is basically convenience. We found out that it was a convenient way to do things, but yeah, it's actually not the smartest thing that we did. So we came up with server-side web properties, and it is that simple. You just change the web property from web property equals true or web property equals client to web property equals server. The framework will handle it, and it will just not send the property to the client anymore. So I can, of course, quickly demo that. So if you go to the studio and we change the web properties, you can do that from the Code Explorer. You can select it and you can say web property. You see that it's now selected as client, and I'm going to make it a server web property, and I'll do that with all of them. And I recompile my application, and I reload it. So now if I go back to the constrained grid sample here, I'm going to show that it still works. So we set it back to 10 and 16 again. It still works, but the main difference is we cannot change it anymore. So remember that when I was typing this in, it would just show the PS filter from. Now it doesn't know it anymore. It's not there anymore. It's undefined. It stays on the server. So that also means that I cannot change it anymore, and the demo that I just did won't work anymore. So that's one of the goals we wanted to reach. So that's how simple server-side web properties actually are. Of course, while we were working on it, we found that there was more to it, so we decided to add more flavors. And by default, a web property equals server has the lifespan that is equal to client web properties. The reason for that is, well, we actually had to do work to get it like that, but the reason for doing that is so it's consistent with the rest of the application and it will behave like you are familiar to. But we could also store them longer because we store them on the server, and that's why we invented web property equals server session. And its lifetime is equal to sessions. So that means that it survives a page reload. If you have worked with web framework applications, you know that if you reload the page, you're kind of restarting the application, and server session variables will survive that reload. And they can actually be shared across browser tabs. Not sure if we're really happy about that, but that's kind of the way it is. So. Yeah.
So discuss from a user perspective what the user is going to do that's going to then define that license. In other words, you talked about page load.
Yeah. The question was, can you define a bit more specific what that lifespan of a server web property is? And well, like I mentioned, the web property equals server, the lifetime is equal to web property equals client, and that means that if you reload the page, the values will be gone. If you navigate to another page, the values will be gone, because basically client web properties are stored in JavaScript variables. And JavaScript variables are cleared by the browser as soon as the page is left or reloaded. The way we bound the server web property lifetime to the client web property lifetime is because we actually use a client web property to tell us which set of server properties belongs to this session, to this user. So now I'm going to change them from server into server session, and what that will show us is that they will survive a page reload. So I'm going to I'm going to reload the page. I'm going to my demo constraint grid. I'm going to set my filter again. Let's pick a different number now. So now we're seeing record 8 till 19. And if I reload the page, I'm going to demo constraint grid. We will see that it now has remembered the values of those properties, so it still filters from 8 till 19. But there is a slight catch there. You see that it didn't remember the values to show in our combo and in our form here. So if you would want to do this in a real application, you want to have that have those values shown there as well. And actually to do that, you can just read the web properties in the onload, because the onload is triggered when the page is loaded. In the onload to read the value from the property at the view level and set the value, the regular client web property, on the combo. So I prepared that here. And I did that for all of them. So now if I go back to my application and I'm going to demo constraint grid, we see that now also filled in the values into the form. So this is what you would expect when you want to have that behavior of the constraint being remembered, even though you're reloading the page. So how does it work? There is a new system table, or system table as in a table that's used and maintained by the DataFlex web app framework. It will be added to your workspace if you create a new web project, and the conversion wizards will add it as well. And it's called web app server props, and actually the values are stored. It serializes the property values to JSON, and it stores them in the database. And as the key, it uses either the session key or a key that's generated and stored in a web property. It supports single or simple data types, but it also supports advanced or complicated data types like arrays and structs, just like regular web properties do since 18.0 or 1. And so it will be a nice convenient place to store data. If you're going to upgrade, well, I already explained this, but new projects will have the table. Migration will add the table. If you're working on SQL, the table will be added as an embedded table. So you probably want to convert it to your database that you're working with. So when you convert it to SQL, it will, I think, automatically be converted. One of the fields is called web app server props.data. It will be converted to a varchar max field, so that it uses the power of that data type within SQL. With embedded, it will spread data over multiple records if it doesn't fit. All right. So I'm going to finish this up quickly before it happens again. Web property equals true continues to work as web property equals client. So you don't have to go through all your code and change web property equals true to web property equals client. But of course, we encourage you to do it. And basically, the general rule will be, if you add a web property to your application that you don't have a piece of JavaScript that uses it, then it could be, or it should probably be, a server web property. So, in most likely, we expect people that to be able to change most of their own custom-made web properties to be changed into server web properties without a problem. So that's it. Thank you for your time, and I think we have a coffee break now.